Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. May I request you to take your seats, please? I hope you had a short but pleasant break. We'll have more chance to network over lunch. We are sorry about the air conditioning. Technicians are working on it, and they have assured us that it's going to be fixed very shortly. And a quick update, we have a live feed on our website, so I urge you to tweet with our hashtag UNV Partnerships Forum PF 2016, and it will turn up on our website right now. I'd like to invite Richard on stage. As you see, he has joined for the rest of the meeting. And Patrick, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm sure that over coffee you have thought a lot about potential questions to throw at the panel, and we're trying to be true to all of those when they come up. Before we hand over to you with questions, we would just like to get into it a little bit again through a few questions that popped up also as a result of the discussion that we have had here. And one really also relates to something Richard already said this morning in his opening when he referred to voluntarism and the refugee situation in Germany and the whole role of voluntarism around that. And I would really like to know from the State Secretary whether that process, what it has actually done around voluntarism. Is there a greater recognition for the role of voluntarism as a result of these discussions, and how do you see that evolve further in Germany?
Well, this huge influx of refugees last year has been a really exceptional situation. We would never have been able to handle the situation by administrations only. So volunteers played an essential role in providing the necessary basic services, in building shelters, in providing food, in just being present and helping. Many, many thousands of people in Germany are still engaged because those who have perspective to stay in our country need continuous support. They want and have to learn German. They try to find jobs and to integrate themselves in our society. And this, again, life is local, and this cannot be done by government decisions. It can only be implemented by individual contacts, and it's really very, very helpful to have so many volunteers, so many people engaged, not only on an ad hoc basis, but really on a permanent basis. Many of them are engaged in sporting clubs, in youth clubs, so all these civil society organizations take part in this integration work. And what we could see is that there are some quite new models of how to cooperate with refugees established by individuals, by individual volunteers. So, for example, from my constituency, parents made the experience that young refugees came into the school classes of their children, and they needed a lot, clothing, nearly everything, because people came to Germany with simply nothing. And they established a platform via Facebook, because if you make a newspaper advertisement, you need clothing or whatsoever, you will get a mass of material, and you will provoke more work, because to coordinate this and to really provide the help in the most efficient way to the people who need it, is quite a lot of work. So this became much more efficient via social network tools, and they did not only advertise what they needed, but they have a permanent communication, what has already been delivered, so what is no longer needed. They didn't seek or look for example, shoes, but they were looking for winter shoes for children in which sizes, so very precise requirements, and they announce already also the fulfillment of this requirement. And this became a very, very useful tool at a local basis in the municipality. And this is quite inspiring. And I just saw the online volunteer platform in our coffee break now. I really think this is some new idea coming in through volunteers, and that's really needed. Before I mentioned the 1,000 people of staff in our ministry, of course this is quite a lot, but governments have to be open for new ideas, for expertise from outside. We don't know everything. If governments are intelligent, they are prepared to actively involve expertise from outside and use the potential that is there on the street.
Thank you. And I think we all agree as well in the sense that what we're seeing here in Germany is that we can really see that volunteering is a two-way street, in the sense that we're not just seeing people volunteering to help the refugees, but actually the refugees really going out there and really and working with schools and so on, and contributing also to social cohesion in the country.
Add, of course, there are many refugees volunteering as well.
Exactly.
And this is a change of perspective. So we used to see refugees in a beneficiary role. We have to learn that many refugees can also be experts in their field, that they can play an active role, and to activize refugees is really a much more promising approach as well.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think that again is such an important element that we need to reflect upon for the future as well. And if we're then saying that Agenda 2030 is a universal agenda, this comes into play. How do we benefit from those capacities that are out there to integrate that into our learning frameworks? Having said that, let me put a question to both Richard and Jill, and I'll give Richard the floor first, because we are talking here about voluntarism in the context of Agenda 2030. And we have made the links and we have said, yes, they link and they are important, but what does it really mean? What does voluntarism in the context of Agenda 2030 really mean? Richard.
We always talk about volunteers as being able to deliver a service. Volunteers are capable of developing value in society by bringing people together. But we in UNV have also seen how those people who provide services, let's say in a context of a UN mission, so we have somebody in, in Haiti, who was running the environmental footprint in that mission, but in the evening was volunteering after work with a orphanage. And in that way created an enormous connection between the mission and actually the local community, which was right next door, which until this volunteer had started actually going out and visiting the church there and working in the orphanage, had never actually seen anybody coming out of that particular mission compound. And we see that volunteers in that way, from a pure UN perspective, can create an enormous connection to the communities that we work in. And therefore, I would see that volunteers in SDGs are also the ones who will be making the connection between that global discussion and actually, if I can put it with the 172 indicator framework, a rather technocratic discussion, and try to see if we can ground that back towards people. And that's where volunteers are essential. I keep talking about volunteers being the amino acids of the SDGs for the very simple reason that if we actually do not digest the SDGs and bring them down to energy that we can use at the local level, It's going to be a beautiful concept all the way up there about how we save the planet, but it won't mean anything to people on the ground. And this is where I can see that you cannot just get the message on the ground by providing information or engaging people online or have His Excellency the President of the country make an important statement on SDGs. SDGs need to be translated all the way down to the community level, and the volunteers will be the translators, whether they are working for the United Nations, whether they are working in government volunteer schemes or in civil society volunteer schemes, or whether they are corporate sector volunteers who are ambassadors for a new future also. We need to have that engagement, otherwise it does not translate down.
Thank you, Richard. Jill, just to add to that same question is then, in that concept of volunteerism in the context of Agenda 2030, how can local and national volunteer initiatives and organizations use the agenda actually to enhance their work?
And really just picking up on the comment, our volunteers, like many of those of organizations in the room, are there to build capacity and to build sustainability. So when the CEO of a partner organization says to me, Tom was a New Zealander, but he became one of us, we forgot he was a Kiwi. He taught us everything he knew, and our lives have changed forever. That's as good as it gets for me, because what we want to be sure of is that these organizations and individuals have had their capacity built so they can continue without us. They don't need us anymore, and that what they do will be sustainable. And picking up on your question again there, we did some research a couple of years ago on exactly what you were discussing, which was the volunteers in an organization, could be government, could be a business, could be another NGO, and they're in a community, because ours, unless it's a really difficult, tense conflict area, live in communities. So we want to know how much were they still in touch. And by year 3, over 80% were still in touch with people, not just in their organization, but in that community. And often they stay in touch on a formal way, but also what we've done now with many of the return volunteers, whether they're graduates or whether they're from the private sector, is that we have a formal e-mentoring, not as advanced as yours, regrettably, but that enables them to agree on some objectives and work on it together. So I think those are ways that happens. Yeah.
Thank you. Sarah, making the link then to UNDP as both the most important client of UNV while also administering it, how do you really see in the agenda as it is unfolding, where do you see UNV come in with regard to the work of UNDP, also in the area of civic engagement, governance, human rights? Are there specific things that UNDP is picking up on?
Thank you, Patrick. Before I go to your specific question on the issue of governance, I'd just like to make 2 reflections on the broader areas where UNDP finds a collaboration with UNV so essential. And the first, I'd like to refer to something that Jill just said, and also Alex before the break. It's this issue of sustainability. And for us as a development organization, of course, impact, results, but also scaling up and sustainability on the ground is absolutely critical. Otherwise, we make an impact or, for a limited time, but we don't have that community ownership, that community buy-in that really drives the change for the community's lives and for generations to come. So I think what we found is working through the communities, and this is where bringing the point to the role of volunteerism at the community, at the local level, it brings that ownership and it brings that drive. So I would just like to really flag that, because I think it so much underpins our vision as a development organization. The other area, broadly speaking, where we cooperate with UNV is on evaluation. We know that we have indicators for the SDGs. We know that we have targets. How do we really know what it is that we're achieving if we don't have the data, we don't have the monitoring, and we don't have the evaluation? So this is one area where we're partnering with UNV. We see it's critically important. Of course, it's at the national level, but again, very much at the local level. So I put those as broad areas. Going to your specific question on governance, ironically, given that I'm about to lose mine, but I would start with the issue of voice. Because I think what we see is that UNVs are really a catalyst. I think a catalyst is the appropriate word for civic engagement. And what we've seen, I would like to draw on the specific experience that we've had first through the MDG campaign, now the SDG action campaign, where it's really unprecedented if you think the effort that was the global effort and reaching out to more than 10 million people around the globe to participate in the My World survey. So if we think that 10 million people for the first time in their lives probably had the opportunity to frame the global development agenda. This is why we're all sitting here. What do they want? What do they expect? And what do they need? And what we saw was that the role of volunteers working at the community level really drove, out of that 10 million, 80% were not connected online. So this is really that community outreach, going out to communities, working with disabled communities, elderly communities across the globe. And a colleague of mine who was working on the MDG campaign at the time gave an example from Haiti, where actually international volunteer, a German, was working hand in hand with a national volunteer, a Haitian, and they went out to the most rural communities, and they were engaging the displaced, the disabled, but they were also engaging the displaced. So imagine being able to find and to engage in that kind of discussion and feeding that back into what has become a global process. So I think this issue of voice is important. It's been important in feeding into the my world and the world we want, but it will also continue to be important in actually the monitoring, the engagement, the visibility around the SDGs. We've all said in this room, we all know the SDGs. It's not the case for the entire world. And I think getting that visibility, getting that advocacy, getting that knowledge, but bringing into people's hearts and lives is critical. And I'm absolutely delighted and thrilled that we actually will have the SDG Action Campaign here in Bonn. And I think there's so many synergies, of course, that we can be having with UN volunteers and, of course, the Staff College. If we look more broadly at the issues of governance, I would highlight a few other areas. One is on the issue of elections. I gave some examples previously before the break, but where we've really been able to contribute to UN volunteers who've been able to support very complex election processes, especially in mission settings. So for example, Haiti again would come to mind, or CAR. And what we've seen is through the quality of the volunteers who have been participating in this, it's actually strengthened and reinforced the UN system's ability to support elections. We've also had what I would say very important cooperation with UNV on other complex issues, for example, on human rights. We have experiences where UNVs have worked together through UNDP programs, together working with national human rights institutions and local or national governments on creating awareness around national capacities to monitor human rights issues, which again brings us back to this such essential element of leaving no one behind and ensuring people have access to justice, that they know what it is, that the training is in place, the advocacy is aware, and that this is nationally owned. So I think those are some of the examples that I would use. I would conclude, while the question is specifically on the issue of governance, which falls so squarely into SDG 16, what we really see in the work that we're doing through the UN country teams. We have more than 100 UN country teams that have been requested by governments for support on mainstreaming and integrating the SDGs into the action plan. And this is where we see that volunteerism, it cuts across all of them. And I think that volunteerism can really drive that agenda of integrating across the SDGs. So we're not just addressing poverty, we're not just addressing gender, but we really drive it across the whole SDG spectrum. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Before I open the floor to questions from the room, I have to be a little bit mean as the moderator as well, because I found myself not too long ago in a meeting with only the private sector. It was 2 weeks ago with the Impact 2030, where we did a presentation on Agenda 2030, and then we would say, what questions would you have? And the very first question that was thrown back by all the companies basically was, why should I care? And here we came as UN people basically standing there like, oops, that's a good question. We don't really have a ready-made answer here. We can talk around it and we got ourselves out of it. But it was a fascinating way of looking at the entire agenda and how one wants to address it. So having been put on the spot in that sense, and since Alex was there, let me turn the table on her now, and basically say, if you're meeting with your colleagues in SAP, and they would ask Agenda 2030 and the SDGs, why should I care? What is your answer?
Why did I get the mean questions? Look, I think if I ever get asked that question, which fortunately I have not, but then it goes back to a lot of people don't know what Agenda 2030 is and what the SDGs specifically are. But I think it's just an expression of actually not having done my job particularly well, because it means something on different levels. One, we have not been able to communicate the importance of Agenda 2030 in the context of our company to the employees, and we have not made it relevant to them. And that is a huge issue. If you were not able to make it relevant to each and every single individual person in the room, we have all failed at our job, basically. And I think the key thing that I think, at least in the private sector, needs to happen is not just this general awareness and understanding of the SDGs, but tie it into what it means to them personally. What does it mean to them as an employee of that company? But what does it also mean to them as a citizen? And that means translating sustainable development and the SDGs into a language that they can understand, into something that becomes relevant for them in the context of where they live and what is important to them in their life. So if they don't care, it means that they haven't understood that the SDGs are important for them as a citizen and for them as individuals and how they lead their lives. But that's communication aspect to it. But the other thing is an experience aspect if you bring volunteering back into it. I think rather than, throwing out wonderful phrases and buzzwords, as we call it in the corporate sector, we have to enable volunteering experiences for employees that connect them to the Agenda 2030, but on a very personal level. And through that experience, they get their aha moment and understand, oh, this is what it means. And this is what it means to me personally. And only through that experience can they then say, okay, I've understood it. I can not only talk about it now, but I understand what the relevance is, and I can actually do more with it, because now I'm so excited about it, I want to continue with these experiences, and I also want to continue volunteering. So it's communication, and it's making sure we have the right type of volunteering experiences available so they can connect to the Agenda 2030, and really translating it down to relevance for each and every individual. Long question. Thank you.
Very good. And
difficult one?
no, but I'm moving on to Richard, because I want to hear from him as well. As Richard, you will move soon on to new professional challenges, and as active proponent of voluntarism and Agenda 2030, and moving to Egypt, and you will get those type of questions from your counterparts. So what would you respond, and particularly also, what would you highlight as one of the most important contributions voluntarism will be able to make in that context?
It's a bit of a tricky question. It's not a bit of a trick. It's a very tricky question to answer that when you actually haven't been to the country for 25 years. So let me underline that what I'm looking at is very much sort of on face value what you have in the media. And also the experience that we've had as UNV actually in the whole of the North African theater in the last 15 years, where we created a very strong engagement on youth, with support also of the German government at that time. Because what we saw very clearly was that youth were trying to find engagements in the way that society was evolving. I remember at one time sitting in a conference in Tunisia when a young person said, I'm very well educated, I'm very well fed, I am clothed, but unfortunately I can't find a job, and therefore I cannot go on with my life, because if I can't find a job, I can't get married. If I can't get married, what is life all about? And very gradually, these young people started articulating that development should not be done to them, but should be done with them. The fact that everything was provided to them to have a baseline good life did not necessarily mean that they were actually given a role in society. And young people want to be a constructive part of society. They want to build. All of us were young once, and I'm sure there's still a couple of young people in the room here, but I remember being young and wanting to change the world. And that has not changed. The next generation wants to change the world in the same way, and they are in the same way storming at it. But we need to find constructive ways of getting that done. And voluntarism is one of those ways where you can give young people a constructive role, where they can learn an awful lot about their role in society and how you build yourself up in terms of a professional profile. And it is an incredible way in which governments and civil society can be seen as fostering the right kind of social cohesion in society. And that would actually argue for very heavy investments in volunteering infrastructure and very heavy investments in the cooperation between governments and civil society in terms of making sure that these volunteers then, these young volunteers, are given proper roles and will be successful.
Thanks, Richard. Okay, we have 25 minutes to really go into discussion with you. So if you have a question, kindly give us your name and also let us know to whom you're addressing the question. If it is a specific one, if it's a general one, please let us know as well. I see here in the front a hand. Do I see more hands? Yes. Okay, let's go from here and then we go to the two ladies sitting behind each other. Please.
Je vous remercie. J'aurais souhaité que les représentants puissent prendre des casques pour mieux me comprendre. Ça va? D'accord. Je vous remercie. Je m'appelle Andy Roland Nzingi Nzingi. Je suis président du Conseil national de la jeunesse du Gabon. Ma première question doit s'adresser au secrétaire d'État. Monsieur le secrétaire d'État, nous avons apprécié l'intégration des réfugiés au niveau de votre pays. Mais toutefois, nous savons que cette intégration et ce soutien de votre gouvernement s'est soldé par un vote sanction dans le cadre du gouvernement de Mme Merkel. Alors, la question dont moi je me pose, est-ce que ce vote sanction ne va pas ici décourager ou bien ralentir l'appui du gouvernement par rapport aux réfugiés et parallèlement décourager l'action des volontaires qui souhaiteraient vraiment s'engager dans le cadre de l'intégration des réfugiés? La deuxième question s'adresse à M. Richard Dictus. Moi, j'ai apprécié cette jonction entre le volontariat et la réalisation des objectifs de développement durable. Et vous avez dit qu'il faut nécessairement s'appuyer sur le volontariat pour ici impulser une nouvelle dynamique dans le cadre des ODD. Mais la question dont moi je souhaiterais également soulever, c'est réellement placer la jeunesse au cœur de vos actions, parce que si l'on prend un continent comme l'Afrique, la jeunesse, ce sont 5% de la population. Et si on prend un pays comme le Gabon, où je viens, la jeunesse, ce sont 10% de la population. Donc, dans le cadre de ce partenariat, moi, j'aimerais comprendre qu'est-ce que la jeunesse a à gagner, quelles sont les actions fortes en faveur de la jeunesse. Et je voudrais terminer peut-être par un plaidoyer en faveur des jeunes de l'Afrique centrale, parce que lorsqu'on parle de volontariat, c'est vrai, moi je suis content de voir ce qui se passe au Mali, ce qui se passe au Burkina Faso, ce qui se passe au Togo, mais au niveau de l'Afrique centrale, ce n'est pas encore ça. Donc je souhaiterais que vous, en tant que coordinateur, vous impulsez beaucoup des actions au niveau de l'Afrique centrale, parce que jusqu'alors, c'est une notion pas encore comprise. Et je prends le cas du Gabon, de 2004 à 2010, et 2015, nous avons essayé de lancer un plaidoyer, mais ce n'était pas facile pour mettre en place un programme de volontariat. Or, avec l'arrivée de M. Paul Armand Meillet, que vous avez envoyé au Gabon, qui a mené un plaidoyer et fait de la sensibilisation, cela a permis au gouvernement de mieux apprécier ces programmes et de l'intégrer dans le cadre des politiques publiques. Et je terminerai également dans le cas de l'Afrique centrale en disant nous avons besoin également d'un réseau, si possible, d'un programme régional qui va nous permettre ici d'avoir une bonne dynamique dans le cadre du volontariat. Je vous remercie.
Merci. We go to... raise your hands, please, please, because they can't find you. Yes.
Good morning. My name is Henrietta De Beer. I work for UNDP in the Office of Human Resources in New York. I want to thank all the panel members, and I want to thank Richard and his team for inviting me to this meeting, which I'm already finding very enriching. My question is about the partnerships that we have been speaking about this morning, and to ask any of the panel members, how do we intend to translate those partnerships that we have already subscribed to at the higher level down to the country level? How do we how will we make these partnerships at the country level work for results? How can volunteering as an approach help with building these partnerships? Thank you.
Thank you. And there was someone behind you. Yes.
Thank you. Hi, thank you very much. My name is Maria Madarami Lewis. I'm the Chief of HR for UNEP. Hi, Richard, my old boss. Clearly, this is, we're all impressed with the work of the UNVs. UNEP has been a huge beneficiary, particularly during the Global South-South, during our UNEA meetings. But what touched my heart this morning in listening to the discussion was the statement by Ms. Pohl about the UNVs in Ebola, during the Ebola crisis. I was born in Sierra Leone, so when Ebola hit my homeland, it devastated all of us. The UNVs came in through rapid deployment, and they lent so much expertise. What goes through my mind is, in many of these countries, and it's not just the Africa story anymore, it's the global story, there are about 50% of the youth that are displaced, that don't have jobs, that are working. The concept of volunteerism is a thought in many of these countries, so it's not been inculcated into the culture. What mechanisms were put in place after post-Ebola, which could actually reoccur, we all know that, for lessons learned from all the work that the UNVs did post-Ebola? How were the youth engaged? We have many kids who don't have jobs, who are wandering the streets in many of our countries, and my own Sierra Leone, who are wandering the street. What partnerships are being forged with these displaced youths to give them something to look to, where we are all not just working for $1, but actually working the global society? And it would be nice to know, in advocating the story of what happened in Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia, just the numbers, because it takes a lot for a young person to go into a place where you think you may die and actually stand up there and volunteer to help society.
Thanks, Mariama. I think maybe we do a first round of replies to the questions, and then we do another round. Mrs. Zilborn, would you like to go first?
Yeah, the question of refugees and migrants in Europe and in Germany is quite diverse. Very diverse experiences. We accepted a lot of refugees coming from Syria, neighboring countries, from countries in conflict. And beyond that, there is growing interest from many, mostly young people all over the world to come to Europe for work. These are two different tracks. And what many people do not understand is that asylum seeking is not a way to get a job in Europe. So we have to find adequate answers. One is the humanitarian task for refugees. A second question is how to organize legal migration and prevent from irregular migration when it comes to access to labor markets. And this is primarily a question of qualification, professional qualification, language skills. And that's why we are working with many partner countries to invest in education, in professional training. So I met many, many refugees, not only in Germany, in Sudan, in many countries of origin and transition countries, young people, 15 years old, 13 years old, 11 years old, on a most dangerous journey across Northern Africa through the Sahara, having no idea, no concept of what the situation in Europe is. And our clear conviction is that we have to create better perspectives there where people are. And this, I think, is the idea of the 2030 agenda, that every human being should have a chance in life where he or she has been born. And Africa as a whole needs 18 million jobs each year. Jobs. So I listened very carefully to what you said from Sierra Leone. Volunteering is not a substitute for creating jobs, of course not. But this is the most ambitious task we have. Africa will need millions of teachers for billions, or well, the additional 1.2 billion people who most probably will be born in only the next generation. This will require maybe 20, 30 or more million teachers that have to be taught now to become teachers very, very soon. So there are indeed many questions that go beyond the questions of integration and how to deal with refugees and migrants in Europe or Germany. We have to understand in Germany, in Europe, that we have to reach out, that we have to closer cooperate with our neighboring countries, at least with our neighboring countries. Of course, there's a prior responsibility in each country for the political elites to provide services for their people. But as I understand it, the Europeans start to understand that Africa is our neighboring continent. And that's why our Chancery has been there again, not for the first time, for the 8th time, by the way, in Mali, in Niger, in Ethiopia, and we are prepared to closer and closer adjust our programs to the needs of our partner countries in the entire MENA region and beyond. We know that you are from Gabon. Refugees come even from Nigeria, from Western African countries, from Eastern African countries, and what is not very well known in Europe, the most part of migration does take place inside countries. 2/3 of the refugees that are registered from the UNHCR are internal displacement, and the rest is situated in developing countries. 90% of the refugees are not coming to Europe and Germany, but stay in their home countries or in transition countries. And we have to understand that we have to adjust our policies in the right way, because if we want to help most of the people, if we want to save as many lives as possible, we have to help most in those areas where the most people are, for sure. So we do a lot in Europe. This is a question of humanity for us. There is some space for integrating people as in our working force, under the condition that they have the necessary skills. But the task ahead of us, and that's our understanding as development ministry, is to do much more to address the growing young populations in many of our partner countries. And just to conclude, in Germany and in Europe, we are old societies. I don't know the average age in Germany. I think it's above 45 years, maybe nearly 50 years, the average age of people. In Africa, the average age is 18, 19 years old. So we have young societies in many developing countries, in particular in Africa. And that's what I always tell to my colleagues and ministers from African countries. The young people in your countries are those ones. They are the majority. The young people are the majority in nearly all the African countries. By the way, the majority of refugees are minors. So we have to address the specific needs of young people in education, in professional training, and in the end of jobs. So what is education and and professional training for if it's not oriented to create jobs? And so our political message is, and that's what Chancellor Merkel announced in Africa and is announcing in Germany all the day long, we need much, much more private sector involvement. And not only trade, we are experts in trade from Germany. This will not be sufficient to create jobs, to sell goods and services to other countries. We need investment. We need companies going abroad, going in developing countries, investing there, creating jobs there, and contributing to more value generated in developing countries. Otherwise, we will not be able to address this huge demand of growing societies. Jobs, needs, innovation, investment, and, well, the awareness that this sort of cooperation is better than to be confronted with the consequences of migration and refugees. So the options we have is change by design or change by disaster. We prefer change by design, and in this context, again, volunteers play a significant role just to get the idea, the concept, the understanding of what is needed in our partner countries.
Thank you. Richard, youth and UNV lessons learned.
One of the most incredible stories that I heard about Ebola was actually in Guinea, when we had a volunteer program officer there who was helping out UNICEF with establishing youth groups. And it was just something that he had done in his previous employment and was something that he really liked to do. And he went out in the community and at a certain moment had developed a network of about 2,500 young people. And this was about talking about issues about adolescent health, was talking about how do they acquire voice in society. There was also a small youth parliament associated with it. And that was going very well. When the Ebola crisis happened, the most important thing that started malfunctioning was the information flow in society, because people were afraid. They were not trusting what came out on the radio or in the news anymore. People could not move from one community to the other. Yet very important messages about personal hygiene and other ways that people could protect themselves from getting Ebola needed to pass along. And these young people were activated, were equipped, were explained what they could do and what they could not do, including the new handshake. Yeah? And they went out, and in the first 30 days of going out, contacted more than 300,000 people. Now, it is impossible to calculate how many lives they saved. That is not clear. But here you have an international volunteer who served as a catalyst to try and get the youth groups organized. You then have the youth groups coming in on a crisis and immediately have the courage, have the creativity of young minds to figure out this is how we shake hands so that we don't really touch in any vital parts. And now we go out to the community and pass the message along. By the way, that part of the process was funded by, not by UNICEF, but by UNDP. It's one of the great success stories that we jointly have. For me, that one exemplifies where the role of youth in the entire construct sits. If you do not make a concerted effort to mobilize young people for the social common good, you will not be able to call on them when there is a crisis. If you also don't call on them to work for the social common good, they may start working for other things. And that you don't want to happen either. There's a very big discussion going on at this moment about youth radicalization. And what do we as a society put towards youth radicalization? Because we cannot create the 18 million jobs that quickly. We have actually failed over the last 25 years to fairly consistently do that. And in the meantime, there is a deficit of actualization space for young people. They can't actualize in society, and therefore they start looking to other things. And if somebody walks up to them and say, here you've got a motorcycle, now you're Hell's Angels, isn't this a nice identity? Young people tend to go into that direction. And this is where we as a society need to figure out how we place an opposite number in there. I always believe in the fundamental truth of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's statement about Le Bon Sauvage, but it was a little bit dated, but essentially he said every person has the inherent desire to do the right thing. And it is about society enabling young people to consistently do the right thing. And that is, I think, a responsibility that we in leadership positions have. Make sure that young people can do the right thing.
Thanks, Richard. How do we translate partnerships to the country level? I think we can go two ways, and we will go two ways. Sarah?
Thank you for all of the questions. I won't touch on the youth because I think between Thomas and Richard, it's extremely well articulated and I think positioned in some of the broader context that we're facing as societies. I think on the partnership at the country level, and I'm very much looking forward to, I think it's a session after lunch where we're actually hearing from the UN volunteers themselves. I met a couple sitting at this table just before the break, and I think this is where we really see the partnerships develop, whether it's partnerships with communities, whether it's partnerships with local authorities. Some of the examples that I mentioned, for example, working with the national human rights institutions and the local authorities on capacity building around issues of access to justice and also monitoring. This cannot be done from the capital level. It can be done certainly through a certain extent through institutions and formal partnerships. But I think it's this hands-on engagement that we have with the volunteerism that takes the partnership to a different level, including very much with the community itself. Can I add one point that wasn't asked to me, but I was reflecting on it during the discussion. I think on the question of youth, it is so incredibly vital and important that we bring the youth into the discussion. And as our UNDP administrator likes to say, and Richard also referred to it, nothing about us without us. And I think that's really an essential part of the dialogue that we're having with the youth engagement. But just another area that is very relevant, I think, in the demographics of the SDGs that perhaps doesn't get spoken about as much, but it's the issue of the elderly. And I think this is also another one we're thinking about leaving no one behind, especially with the demographic changes, with longer lifespans, also some of the vulnerabilities that come around that. Also with the data gaps. I was in a discussion last week where looking at data, and for example, on the issue of gender-based violence, violence against women, many countries don't even have data on that over the age of 49. And I think this is really something, as we're looking at the totality of leaving no one behind across the spectrum, the youth is an essential part, the internally displaced, and I'm glad that came up with such force into the discussion. The elderly, there's so many different population groups that we're discussing, and I think it's really essential to the role that volunteerism plays in that progress towards the SDGs. Thank you.
Sarah, and just to come back again to the question of partnerships and how do we translate that to the country level. Alex, could you give a very brief overview of what you are actually doing as SAP together with GSK at country level and what type of activities you're taking forward? Because that's a good example, I believe.
I think important to understand is that I'm a pragmatist and I'm a very action-oriented person. So while I sit here and I listen to all of you talk, I think this is all incredibly important. At the same time, you have to start somewhere very concrete as well. And you have to be able to demonstrate, even at the lowest level, that you can make change. And if you make things too complex and too complicated right from the start, you might lose a lot of people in the partnership. So I think, when through Impact 2030, when we were starting to think about, what does collaboration in corporate volunteering mean, and how can you make it happen? How can you ensure that you have a few companies that come together and say, you know what, we have a common issue that we are addressing. We're doing it individually at the moment. How can we ensure that we now start working together and that through our joint work, we ensure that 1 + 1 = 3 and it's not just 2? And I mean, I don't think I have to tell anyone in this room that partnerships are not easy. 3 weeks ago when we were in New York, we were sitting in front of the private sector audience and we told them that it was very easy. But it was only because we wanted to motivate them and to encourage them to do it. Because if you start bringing all these complications right up from the start, nobody's going to try it, and especially not the private sector. Why should they invest their time then? So basically, a colleague of mine, my counterpart at GSK, GlaxoSmithKline, and myself, we were at a conference. We were asked to speak about corporate volunteering, and before that, we briefed each other about what we were doing, and we looked at each other and we said, you know what, talking is nice, but we should actually show and demonstrate what it means to take action and how we can collaborate with each other. So at that conference, at the panel, we made a joint commitment that we would define a collaborative project in volunteering. And 9 months later, we are in the midst of it. And I will spare you all the trials and tribulations we went through. But the fact is that we managed to find a way of working with each other to marry basically our corporate volunteering programs that we have, hone in on one particular country and on one particular organization only, so very pragmatic, and we decided to work together in Rwanda with an organization called Partners in Health, and we basically had a joint team there. Now, 9 months ago when we started talking to Partners in Health about this, if you had asked them at that time, do you want to do this, they would have they honestly shook their heads. If we can say no, we would say no at this point in time. We don't really want to do it. Because we don't know what to expect. We know what to expect with a volunteer that comes in for 6 months, but we don't know what to do with an SAP volunteer that only comes for 4 weeks, because that's basically what we do. And they got a bit frightened by it, but they also felt they couldn't say no, which is an issue in itself, right? If you ask them now that we've done the project, or we're sort of in the final conclusion of it, they've done a complete 180. They've told us it was the most valuable volunteering project they've ever been involved in, and they've had a lot of volunteers join their organization. And the reason was we brought the right people with the right skills, with the right mindset, complementing each other from 2 companies, and really working hand in hand, and nobody caring whether it was SAP or GSK. The 4 weeks, SAP volunteers brought a sense of urgency, while the GSK volunteers who are still there are now bringing enablement and implementation and sustainability. I think, to make a very long story short, what we wanted to show is that you don't have to overcomplicate things. Sometimes it's good intention that is the starting point, and as long as you share values and philosophy, and you are willing to compromise, and you're willing to leave your egos at the door, you can create a 1 + 1 = 3 impact, even if it is at a very low level. But who knows where that goes? I mean, we're so excited about it now that we have continued conversations about how to drive this GSK Partners in Health and SAP partnership. Because it is now a partnership. Before that it wasn't, but now it is a partnership. And now we're sort of all on equal footing, and we now can have very in-depth conversation. Okay, how do we make this broader now that we have demonstrated impact?
Thanks, Alex. And before the Q&A started, I had said at least to 4 people signal the time, because that's going to be a problem. And now I have 4 people at least signaling that the time is up, so I can't pretend to ignore them, because they're all in different parts of the audience. So having said that, I think what we have tried to do here with all the really important messaging coming through is there are so many of the elements that we have touched upon that will be worked out through the remainder of the agenda. So take this really as that teaser that gets you into the subsequent discussions. If there are questions that we have not been able to get to, please make sure that they do come up in those subsequent sessions. I do apologize for dealing with the time badly in that sense. I do, however, also believe that what this session alone has done through the different stakeholders, and that in itself is incredibly important, because we're talking about multi-stakeholder engagement, the willingness and the recognition of the essential element of volunteerism is without doubt there. What we now need to do is to see how we translate that into concrete results, concrete programs on the ground where we bring the different elements together. That doesn't necessarily mean that everything has to go through one mechanism. There are different ways to go about it. But at the end of the day, if we want to make Agenda 2030 and its implementation a success, we cannot do without voluntarism, and we cannot do without multi-stakeholder engagement and consensus-building processes that we're trying to cater to. So with that, I would like to ask you for a round of applause for our panelists. And would like to hand over to our Master of Ceremonies, which is over there.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, panelists. We'll now break for lunch. And during the networking lunch, you will have the opportunity to explore our side events at the virtual corridor. We are showcasing our new UNV website, and you will also be able to explore the UNV online volunteering service booth. You will also be able to explore the experience of human stories behind today's pressing issues through the UN Virtual Film Reality Series, the 360-degree videos. We would like to thank our colleagues from the UN SDGs campaign for the opportunity to showcase these at our forum. Please note that the interministerial lunch will take place in room Tokyo, and our protocol focal point will guide them there. The next session starts at 2 p.m. In the meanwhile, I wish you have a good lunch and fruitful conversations. Thank you.